The only problem about having video is you can't see when I'm smirking.
Michael, we've already hit record.
Well, hello.
This will be the least professional introduction we've done. Welcome to From the Research Chair. This is episode number 26. We're going to be talking about geopolitics. I'm Jason Voss. My partner is
Michael Falk, the person who interrupts the outset of the recording.
Not a problem. It's good laughs, right? It gives us the From the Research Chair. We've got the image that some people have complained about is looks like a bordello. People have complained they don't like the red wallpaper. It's meant to be a living room where people are comfortable to talk. So we have that atmosphere.
It was Sherlock Holmes.
Exactly. Well, so let's dive in. The first thing on our agenda was a simple framework for understanding. I have to go first necessarily. I'm the person who put that bullet point up there. It's usually awkward when the person who's the host also then goes first, but may I? Michael, do you mind?
I don't mind.
All right.
But who am I to say we should go in order? So, Jason, your call, my friend.
Yeah, so I'm going to hit the framework because it at least for my remarks, I'll be hitting on them a bunch, and it won't make sense then to retro those other comments. It's setting up a context for how I tend to think about these things. So my simple framework is that geopolitics is real simple. It's the intersection of politics with geography and history, hence the name geopolitics. But politics, I like to break out into three subcategories. Politics is the convergence of people, power, and preferences. And by understanding people, power, and preferences and how they interact with history and geography, by understanding those five things, you begin to get something very useful as an investor, which we can hit on in a second. Michael, let me give the audience an example, and then I'll turn it over to you. I bet you have your own framework of thinking about these things. The country of Greece. Let's take Greece and its ancient history as an example. If you want to understand the modern Greece, you have to understand its history, where it came from. You have to understand its geography, its people, its the power that it resides in Greece, and its preferences. By the way, I tend to think power is an outcome more so than it is a starting point and assumption, but we'll come back to that in a second.
It's a residual.
It's a residual, totally, and driven by these other things. So the people of Greece are fated to occupy a peninsula, which is very, very, very mountainous. And so the history of Greece is one of city-states. It never really was a nation. It was a collection of city-states. And the reason why is because of this mountainous region. Back pre-airplane, pre-good transportation, there weren't a lot of roads. And so acropolises literally mean hill towns, and they formed hill towns, and they were warriors, and they warred over the limited resources that were there. There wasn't a lot of agriculture in the northern part of Greece. And so consequently, their geography dictated their preferences. We build up on mountainsides. It dictated the power that was available to them and how they tended to express. They had a lot of time up on that hillside. They tended to be philosophical. They tended to reflect on their circumstances. That created a unique culture. Fast forward to the modern era, you would never predict Greece to be you would predict it to be a shipping powerhouse because the industry that's there is they're geographically poised at one end of the Mediterranean that bridges Asia with Europe and also Africa. So their geography has dictated a ton of this. And predetermined elements are predictable elements, and predictable elements are investable. So I'll pause there. But anyway, I could go on with the Greek example, but I think that my framework helps to explain some of these outcomes relative to Greece. Michael. Michael's dropped off. Well, rather than wait for Michael, I'll continue on with the Greek example and give him time to rejoin. In that Greek example, you would not expect the way the United States does for it to be especially powerful because in addition to being poised geographically in the Mediterranean, which is really lovely for its shipping business, it also means it's been vulnerable to invasion, which in fact it's been invaded many times and from many different directions. Let's take the United States by contrast, and this may be a controversial statement. Many people think the United States' gift to the world is democracy. and that, better ideas and better inventions. I would say that the United States is the gift of great and blessed geography. Let me explain, and this will help understand the geopolitics and why it helps give you additional understanding with regard to investing. In the United States, to the north, we have Canada. Hi, Simon. And it's culturally, going back to people, power, and preferences, very, very similar to the United States. So similar, in fact, that the differences are very minor. You almost have to live in one of the two nations and visit in an extended way to really notice significant differences. To the south, the United States has Mexico, less culturally similar. Its roots are in Spain rather than England and France, the way Canada is. The United States also shares roots with England, France, and also Spain, but less so Spain, other than the desert Southwest. But Mexico to the south, there's jungle on the eastern side of the border, and on the western side of the border, there's a vast desert. And so consequently, you don't really have to, and the United States hasn't really had to worry so much about a less friendly or less culturally aligned neighbor. To the east, the United States has the Atlantic Ocean, to the west, the Pacific Ocean. And in the middle of the United States, something very, very interesting. Rivers that don't just flow north and south, but also rivers that flow east and west. That's blessed geography. Why? The cost to transport things via water versus overland is significantly cheaper. So the United States historically had an agricultural base. Canada also has great agriculture. Other nations have great agriculture, but to get it to the coasts is much more expensive in other nations than the US because of those east-west flowing rivers. So from the get-go, just by understanding the geography of the United States and how it interrelates with things, you would expect the United States to be powerful. And I would argue a blessed geography. That blessed geography in World War II served it especially well. There was some activity from the Japanese and the Germans offshore in the United States, but not a whole lot. Post-war, the United States had a rich capital base from all the things that we've just described, and it benefited from never really having been invaded. Europe does not share that. Take any nation within Europe, and it's a good chance it's landlocked. There's just a river separating itself from its neighbor, culturally very, very different languages, so on and so forth. You would expect in that environment of clashing cultures to be a long history of war. And in fact, that is Europe's history, unfortunately, going back from about 500 AD. Going back to the US post-World War II, it benefited from being both manufacturer and lender to the people who bought its goods. And I would argue that a lot of the United States ascendancy, people forget that heading into World War II, the United States was actually not, it was considered a global power, but not the preeminent global power. Exiting World War II, because of its geography, I would argue it looked ascendant. It looked like it was American values. And there's something to be said for American values, sure. But a lot of it has to do with the geography. And if you don't understand that, then you can't necessarily understand American decline either, right? American decline, still have that blessed geography, but if it were just American ideas and those American ideas were still present, then we would expect to see kind of the similar thing. But what's disappeared is America is no longer the only lender. It's no longer the only manufacturer. It's not both of those things. It has to compete globally. Michael, I'm glad to see you rejoined. I was giving additional deep case studies for how Greece's situation is a little bit predictable based on its geography and understanding of people power preferences, as well as the United States. Are you able to come off mute? No. Well, now we're in a pickle because I could go on, but I don't want to outpace and out-comment you if you had additional comments that you wanted to give. Such is the nature of doing these things live. I'm going to continue. Michael, when you come on board, feel free to comment on anything that you have heard me say up to this juncture. So the next thing that we're going to hit is why is geopolitics important to investors? So Michael and I did a podcast, and it looks like Michael's just dropped off again. We did a podcast earlier in our history on scenario planning. And we labeled scenario planning as one of the things that we wish more investors would do. Scenario planning is a very similar framework to the framework you use to understand geopolitics. So let me explain and why it's powerful and why both Michael and I think it's important for investors. And this part I know Michael affirmed with, because we've had many sort of gentlemanly discussions about the import of geopolitics as well as scenario planning. So in scenario planning, the way you do scenario planning is you start with identifying the predetermined elements of a situation. These are the things that just absolutely cannot be changed. So these would include things like demographics, really tough. Boundaries of nations, really tough to change, especially in the short to medium and even the long terms. Gigantic government spending programs, very difficult to change. The politics of a nation are, and the nature of a people, kind of tough to change. These are predetermined elements. You'll note from the framework earlier I gave for geopolitics, many of those predetermined elements are also present, right? Geography, where are we on the planet? What's our historical situation? How has that driven the culture of a nation or of a region, et cetera, et cetera. Next in scenario planning, next in geopolitics, you have what are uncertain elements. So in scenario planning, uncertain elements might be things like, will the China trade war with the United States result in acrimony that leads to warfare? Might it lead to other things? Michael, I think you just joined. Is that your 312 number?
I am on by telephone now because of the computer issues.
All right. So while you were going through your computer issues, I gave in-depth examples with Greece and the United States and how geography, history, and people power preferences has driven some of the narratives around the culture. I then was comparing it, and I moved to bullet point 2, which is why is this important for investors? And I said that geopolitics and understanding of it's very similar to scenario planning. Scenario planning, we have predetermined elements like geography, like demographics, et cetera. And then there are also uncertain elements. I will pause there. You must contribute now that you're on board.
I must. Yeah, before I left, right, power is a residual. So let's put that aside for just a moment, because that's an outcome. What we're really talking about right now are inputs, right? Geography, an undeniable input and an unavoidable input, for good or for bad. The thing that we haven't spent a lot of time on it talking about are preferences. Jason, I like your format, so let's run with it. When we get into preferences, what do people want? Well, the first thing they want, obviously, is a comfortable life. Now, comfort, we can all argue about what that is defined as, but can we at least begin with saying access to food, access to water, things like that, good shelter, safety. So those are the base preferences. We might even say they're Maslowian. Well, now bring geography into that and bring a perspective of where power lies into that. So Jason, I'll make another stark example. You used the geography of Greece and America. A few years ago, we had this little thing called the Arab Spring. Well, how did the Arab Spring happen? Food shortage, food inflation. People went hungry, started becoming hungry, and we got an Arab Spring. That's what drove it. Now, it was enabled by social media or communication devices such as our smartphones. And now we can start to bring in more elements into the scenario planning that you mentioned about why and how we might want to start to think about these things. How's that for an entree?
It's brilliant. You're right about the preferences, because the preferences tend to be from a scenario planning point of view, the uncertain elements, because preferences do change and people seek power so they can influence those preferences, right? So those could be religious preferences, they could be legal preferences, they could be cultural preferences, like we like streaming versus television, we like cable versus some other thing, we like computer games better or video games better than these. all of these tend to dictate different outcomes, and they tend to be uncertain. Our ultimate point with bullet point 2, both Michael and I have said this before, is we don't know why investors don't spend more time evaluating predetermined elements, because they're predictable, and because they're ignored, there's alpha. So predictability, sans people don't really spend a lot of time assessing them, usually means there's alpha left on the table.
Yeah, and let's give a couple other simple examples, just for giggles, right? China, if you go back in history, was the power, was where a lot of evolution and innovation occurred, and then it stopped. Well, how did it just seemingly stop? Well, that got into how power impacted it. Now, fast forward today, you've got over 1 billion people. You've got a strong bias of male versus female due to the one-child policy. You have the bulk of the population entering what, their 30s, 40s, 50s? Let's say that those 2 decades. Now we have a demographic topic that can significantly influence geopolitics. What resources does China have? What resources don't they have? And now we can again start to inform the scenario planning. Geography and history matter.
They absolutely do. And of the two, geography and history, I think geography is the least appreciated of them. History, oftentimes people who are investors are quote unquote students of the market, meaning that they have a historical bent. That was one of the things I really liked about finance when I entered, was I liked to study the history. Prior to finance, what made me, I think, a good investor is I was my neighborhood's meanest, most qualified baseball card trader, and in part because of my love of history. But the geography, I think, is one of the things that people ignore. I'll give one additional example. I had also given the example of Europe. A lot of the boundaries are rivers. Look at Switzerland. Switzerland is able to remain neutral for so long because it's surrounded by mountains. It's a tough thing to deal with. Pre-airplane, Switzerland was a very tough, nation to involve yourself in, and also not a lot of natural resources back in the day that people necessarily coveted. But in terms of the geography, I want to talk about Russia. Russia has no real natural boundaries on its western side. It will always require buffer states around it. And so it will probably always meddle in Estonia and Lithuania and Poland. It will meddle in Ukraine, because it's real easy to just sort of pass into Russia. And then let's factor in its history. Has that happened to them? Is that a likelihood, or is there a barrier to invasion? No, not really. Have they been invaded? Yes, they have. So now we've invoked the history thing. So what are the Russian people's preferences with regard to foreign incursion? Do they like it? Do they themselves do it to protect themselves? Yeah, they do. So this is where some of the predictability comes about from understanding these elements.
Yeah, and now when we bring it into investing, the most base level of thinking about it, let's start at a base, is how does that impact, how might that impact a given company? Where is that company located? And now we can start to think about how geography and history and demographics and preferences might impact a given company. And now we can start to form a base of how that can impact investing. So if Russia starts to invade on the Western front, so to say, what companies exist there? That is the simplest way of thinking about how geopolitics can matter.
Yeah, agreed. And I'll give you another example, like Brazil. There was a story of the BRICS countries, that they were waxing ascendant, 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago. And with regard to Brazil, a natural resource treasure, no doubt. But what people didn't appreciate about its geography is all their natural resources exist on top of a vast plateau, and to transport things to the coasts so that it then can be distributed to the world, extraordinarily expensive. And Brazil has invested a ton of money trying to interconnect and, gridify, if you will, its infrastructure so that it can begin to tap some of that natural wealth. But that is a huge capital outlay that they have to do at the beginning. So you can't just look at the numbers, is what Michael and I are arguing. Pull out a map and look at stuff. Let's give one micro example. I owned a company one time, their manufacturing plant, their sole manufacturing plant. This is a small cap stock, if I remember correctly. And I apologize, I don't remember what name it was. They had their manufacturing plant next to the Mississippi River. Great for transportation, can get it south down to New Orleans, can ship out your goods globally. But the Mississippi River flooded and knocked out all their manufacturing. And stupid me, even though I'm a fan of geopolitics, I never thought to ask, where is your manufacturing located? Oops.
Yeah, what you're talking about now, Jason, are always trade-offs, right? We can talk about good geography or more challenging geography, but we also then have to bring in what are the risks of that geography. It is no secret, shouldn't be no surprise why the United States was able to develop the way it did. Oceans on the east and west, buffers of protection, basically friends to the north and south, buffers of safety. Mississippi River, bisecting the country for shipping purposes. And then finally, a latitude that makes the Midwest good for growing food. It was a geographic gift.
Yeah, and then in the West, in the more mountainous parts of the U.S., vast resource of minerals that could be exported just colossally. And then, of course, natural resources, petrochemical, right? Oil, natural gas riches as well. A blessed geography, no doubt. Though Americans like to, craft a mythology about ourselves that it's our great ideas and our American way, and there is something to that, no doubt. But when you compare the hand we have been dealt as Americans relative to the rest of the world, wow, we're fairly lucky.
Well,
so
World War I, World War II fought on somebody else's land.
Yeah.
And the reality is we have been unfettered in our ability to grow and develop. Geography is a big deal.
Yeah, and while you were offline, I had made the point that, exiting World War II largely unscathed. I think there was a U-boat sunk off the coast of the eastern U.S. Off of South Carolina, I think, if I'm not mistaken. There are a couple of incursions by the Japanese in the West, Pearl Harbor, obviously, but by comparison to other places in the world, almost unharmed. And boy, it's great to be both lender and manufacturer to the world. And have survived largely intact. I would say that a lot of the ascendancy of the United States post World War II had to do with just that, the geography.
Correct.
So let's talk about ramifications, good and bad. You touched on it a little bit. What maybe the way to run through this, and Michael, of course, correct me if you have a different thought. Let's go by region. Let's go or by nation. China. What are the good things and bad things about China's geography and geopolitics?
They don't have energy naturally within their geography. They have got to buy energy, historically, whether it be coal or oil. And this is a country that has to and is rapidly shifting to things like wind and solar because it is an incredible protection for their financial infrastructure. They don't have to import them if they're able to convert to those cleaner sources of energy. That is a big deal because if they stop or slow down their buying of coal and oil, think about the financial ramifications for the countries that have been shipping that to them.
Of course. Yeah, and let's comment too, but this is bringing the scenario planner's view of the world. Let's assume they solve that problem, right? They become energy independent or close to it. What does that mean for now China's preferences? What does it now mean for its people, given it actually has fairly blessed geography as well? Less friendly neighbors are bounded by mountains or desert, right? The Gobi Desert protects China to the north. Then you have Siberia, which last I checked, nobody's, the real estate market in Siberia isn't what it is in Miami, shall I say, et cetera, et cetera. What's China look like if they solve that problem? Let's scenario plan this.
They look a lot stronger, if only because they've lowered their costs of infrastructure materially, and they have raised they've hurt the revenues of countries like Australia. As an example, that is a big shipper of energy resources.
Yep. And I would expect China, if you are an investor in China, if you want to see cutting edge, leading edge tech, you would, especially if you're an ESG investor, that would be an interesting place to look because they have an imperative. The way Russia has an imperative to meddle in the politics of the nations on its western border, China has an imperative because of its geography, because of its history, to solve this energy problem. So again, this is almost a predetermined element. It's not very uncertain. What's uncertain is how committed are they to, capital flows to solving that problem. It's an imperative, by the way, I'll interject. If you follow at all the news in the Straits of Malacca, which are the narrow straits of islands off the coast of Singapore, where all of China's energy must transit, again, dictated by geography, and the fact that China owns some islands in those straits, and they have literally shipped sand to those islands to expand their borders so they can better project power into the straits to ensure that energy flow. If you're willing to build an island, you can assume that's a strategic imperative.
Or another way of saying that, Jason, it is a pretty significant preference that they solve this issue, or if not solve it, at a minimum satisfy their demand.
So let's rewind, still on China. What would we expect if China solves its energy problem? What would we expect it would do vis-a-vis Taiwan? Now let's interject the preferences part, because this is a preference. They have stated a preference to reacquire the Republic of China, right? Taiwan. What would we expect China to do in that scenario?
Well, it is more likely, right, we're in scenario planning, more likely that they take an aggressive action to reacquire Taiwan. Let's just say they desire it because of semiconductor technology that is massive on the island of Taiwan. So they now have a greater likelihood of flexing their strength if they're energy independent to go ahead and do that. Again, it's not a certainty, but it's a higher likelihood, because now we go into a new demand, AKA preference. And the preference is, if we used to think that data was the new oil in the world, well, then semiconductors are the pathway to that data.
Agreed. Yeah, and the rare earth minerals as well, which they have a virtual monopoly on. So let's go to our next.
Hold on.
Yeah, sure.
They don't have a monopoly on the rare earth minerals as much as the media projects based upon things that I've read. What they have is they don't have OSHA in China. Let me explain. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration.
Right.
So they can send an army of men, pay them to go ahead and mine this incredibly dirty, incredibly dangerous stuff. These same rare, quote unquote, rare earth minerals exist in friendlier places, but places that are more developed and do not wish to risk the health of their people to try and get at them.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, the United States also has in terms of locked up in the ground, again, a blessed geography, a number of rare earth minerals to be extracted. So let's go to our fourth bullet point, ramifications of globalization, both good and bad. I'll let you take the lead there.
Globalization has lifted more people out of poverty around the world than anything else that has preceded it in history. Let me explain a little bit more. Globalization is capitalism. We can argue whether it needs more rules or not the point here. The point here is capitalism has beget globalization. It has searched out the low-cost producer. It has searched out the comparative advantage manufacturers, and we have created, as a result, bigger and more business around the world, which has employed more people, which has provided more goods and services to the rest of those local populations. Globalization has done wonderful, wonderful things. Now, because so much of the world now, going back to one of your three things, Jason, politics. Politics have started to become more common language within societies. What I mean by that is politics have become of greater interest to more people in societies around the world. Leaders of those societies are leveraging or stoking those politics such that, quote unquote, we as a country need to be stronger or more independent from. We need to be, and I'll stop there and finish the thought, which is globalization has evolved to a point where we have some risks now. If we think of globalization as a good thing, some aspects of globalization are now at risk because of political diatribes and quote unquote strongmen in different countries who are at risk of damaging or reversing some of the globalization that has been achieved over the last 3 decades.
So I'll highlight another bad. I agree with the goods, right? Capitalism, buy low, sell high. Investing, buy low, sell high. Spread business is good if you have good preferences motivated by a grounding in morals. That spread, the profits can be invested in things like education, healthcare, good housing, etc.
Good.
Agreed.
Yeah.
The bad you didn't mention, I'm surprised you didn't mention, is that we now have, because of globalization being a transmission mechanism for culture, right? We now, because of interconnectedness and networking, hello, everybody around the world who's joined the call. We can peer into other people's lives and develop new preferences. So that's potentially a risk, because our ability to peer in there and develop different preferences may then create frictions with regard to the history and the politics within given nations.
Yes.
Such that there's agitation and social unrest, even within geographies, right? So give you an example, and this isn't my main point, but as I frequently do, I've followed my own rabbit down the hole. In the United States, it used to be the case that pre-internet, you might have kind of marginalized fringe ideas, but good luck when television was or telephone and driving around in your community were your means of sounding out the rest of the world to see if you had community around your odd beliefs, right? So said another way, there was peer pressure ultimately to be like, you're kind of strange, dude. or gal and alter your preferences, so that you're a little bit more normal. But with the internet, now you really only need 10 other people to feel a sense of community, no matter how crazy your idea is. So it's another thing that globalization and networking, if you will, that globalization is just networking through different means, has provided, and that's caused stress, is that people are less open in that environment temporarily. My prediction is temporarily. I think these things will tend to work themselves out, may take a generation.
Jason, I agree. You have gone down your own rabbit hole. Now, while I agree with what you said, we have to bring it back up.
I'm coming. Give me a chance. So back out of the rabbit hole, back to geopolitics, back to the state of the world. Globalization has served as a network for transmitting COVID. It's also served as a transmission mechanism for global climate change. The problem is we now have brought problems on a global scale, but our institutions are all local. And don't talk to me about the United Nations. Look, I confess my politics are liberal.
No, rabbit hole.
Yeah, I know, rabbit hole. No, not just rabbit hole, blind alley. But
you stuck the landing, my friend.
I stuck the landing.
Global problems and local institutions.
Exactly. Don't name the United Nations. We have global problems, but local institutions, and that is a problem. And that, to me, is the downside of globalization, is we don't have a means and mechanism for dealing with the global problems that globalization has brought.
Well, I don't know. I want to be a little cautious here. I don't know that globalization is to blame for global warming, because each individual local country has contributed to global warming. Now, globalization helped establish industry across the world, so I will give you that.
Nobody set out to do climate change. It wasn't intentional. It's an outcome of the economy growing massively. That's it. And that's globalization.
It's the residual that we could not have foreseen that we have unfortunately achieved.
Exactly.
But so I want to be careful. COVID, yes. COVID would not have been transmitted around the world if it weren't for globalization. So, Jason, great points that I think it was worthy for us to dialogue on, even if only briefly.
Yeah, and so the reason I bring this up is that's the downside. This is the trade-offs, to borrow your language, of globalization, is that it is a transmission mechanism, right? I can within 30 hours, the longest transportation adventure I've ever had is to go to Burma, or Myanmar as it's called here in the United States. I think point to point was 38 hours. So from just about any point on the globe, I'm 38 hours away from wherever it is I want to go. There are exceptions, of course, like good luck getting the Southern Sahara, like Southern Libya, tough. Good luck getting into deepest, darkest Siberia, tough. But most places are interconnected with about a day or day and a half. And that's an issue. And then, of course, climate, which affects.
Oh, hold on. You say that's an issue. Okay. But can we appreciate how miraculous that is?
Oh, it is.
I mean,
no doubt.
That would be a lifetime 100, 200 years ago.
Yeah.
To make that trip.
Of course.
So what we're saying is that, again, trade-offs. There's good stuff and bad stuff. We, unfortunately, too often focus on the bad stuff. That doesn't mean we don't have to, but we have to appreciate that this has brought a lot of very positive things. Back to geopolitics.
Of course.
What countries house what businesses that could be impacted by the intersection of people, preferences, and politics.
No, you said it right. People, power, and preferences. People, power, preferences equals politics.
Yeah, so we have to do that examination, but not for giggles, not for cocktail chatter, but for what is the impact on business. Because while we think there are neat and ordered geographic lines on a map. In the real world, these lines are ludicrous because businesses have suppliers in different parts of the world, AKA supply chain. They have buyers in different parts of the world. These geographic lines are historical. Business lines, suppliers and buyers are not. So we have to try and understand how businesses could be impacted by this intersection.
Agreed. So the last point I want to make, and then we'll hit our final bullet point, is another one of my mental models that I carry around is that institutions are established to support and promulgate values. And one of the ways you can measure corruption and possible trouble, and this plays into the geopolitics that we've been talking about today. If institutions remain in service to the values, there's likely a low level of corruption. When values are bent to serve institutions, and the institution is what's preserved, you have trouble. Why do I bring this up? We currently, with globalization and the downside of globalization that we've just been discussing, we do not have globally an alignment of values, right? So North Africa is very different values wise from many places in the southern sub-Saharan part of Africa. The Middle East, very different values. Europe, different values, even within different geographies within Europe, they're roughly kind of aligned. Then you got the United States, yeah, there are differences in values. My point is in a world that lacks a global institution, because of these differing values, my prediction, we don't get a global institution that solves these problems anytime soon. The only way for the values to lead to a global institution is for the real value to be survival, and everybody's unified on that, and we're not there yet. So when I hear ESG, noble effort, but it's going to be a long-tailed effort is my prediction.
Sadly, I cannot disagree. The reality here is the base question, what do these people want? And we can apply that question to any country. And then we can start to ask more questions to get into the scenario planning. But Jason, yeah, survival is the base. The problem is survival itself gets to be very unclear. Let me give you an example. Survival of the species, we would rate very highly, but that's a global perspective. The local perspective is, I just need the creek not to rise too high during my lifetime. Or is it, I need the creek not to rise too high during my child's lifetime? Well, what if I don't have children? So even what seems like a really simple and clear aligned value of survival on a local level becomes very unclear very quickly.
Yeah. So our last bullet point that we promised to talk about today, possible hotspots. Go, my friend.
Well, this goes to power. Let's go to Iran just for fun. Oh, that sounds awful. All right. Iran, highly mountainous. We know the geography. We know the power lies within a preference for a specific religious stability. And that religious stability is anti other religions that exist. I'll say it as plainly as that. But for them, because of what that society needs to prosper and to promulgate itself, they need to project power outside of their borders to anyone who is anti them. So the question is, we're not concerned about companies in Iran. We're concerned about where they want to project their power and how that can interfere on the globalization stage.
Okay.
Is that a good example?
It is a good example, and I like that you tied it back to our framework. I agree. I'm more sanguine about Iran than maybe you are, but we haven't talked about that in depth, so I can't confirm or deny that.
Yeah. I didn't say I was worried about them. I just gave them as an example.
Oh, okay. Well, our segment's possible hotspots, and you led with Iran. So to me, I interpreted that as your number one hotspot.
The hottest of all the hotspots has to be China.
Yeah.
Because of what China's preferences are and what they have as an ability to pursue those preferences. I think we have to consider them a hotspot. But at the same time, it begs a question. Should Chinese equities, as an example, and I'm not talking about the giant internet companies, smaller companies, innovative companies, pursuing the preferences, should these be a part of your portfolio as a fixed geographic allocation in the near term? Jason, back to you.
Spoken like a former global macro strategist.
I can't help myself.
So I think China is also the first one, and I'll phrase it slightly different. China's got a fork in its road, and the fork in the road is between the preferences and power, right? So the reason they were able to become a capitalistic power is because they finally embraced capitalism. But the political structure of communism remains, right? Even if the blessings of their economic distribution are no longer communistic, right? They're capitalistic. And so the fork in the road is, which of these two sources of power do we want to embrace? And if it chooses capitalism, then it's going to have to dial back any geopolitical designs, say on Taiwan. It may, in their pressures, and this is the fork in the road. I think this is a tension within China. There are those who want communism to be the dominant idea or preference, and those who want capitalism. If capitalism wins out, they won't invade Taiwan. It'd just be better to normalize relations and put in place a trade deal. If the preference is communism and all of the sort of monolithic power that comes with that, then you could see Taiwan. So to me, like if I'm an investor, the thing that I'm monitoring is the internal politics of China to see which narratives rule the day. And because the media in China specifically is controlled by the body politic, if there's checking on geopolitical, eyeballing of the Republic of China, alias Taiwan, and the capitalists are in the press able to check it, that's a pretty strong indication that those forces are prevailing.
And let's advance that. So forget about the news reports from people pontificating outside of the country. Who do you know? Who is in the country? Who is seeing and living through the changes? I can start with a real simple question. Are the 1.3, 1.4 billion people, by and large, are they not hungry? Are they not sick? Do they feel there are opportunities to better themselves or better their children? And if those things are in place, then that natural tension, Jason, that you highlighted, the communist versus the capitalism, that natural tension will continue for longer than we think it can, because people at the bottom are satisfying the Maslowian first rung.
Yeah, and there's a famous old yarn that revolutions are not started by the poor; it's always the middle class. And that could be potentially a whole nother rabbit hole. I won't go there. But as China's middle class grows, I would think that is going to be ever greater attention, meaning communism versus capitalism internally there. So what's your next hotspot?
Oh, do we need another one? That is
Let's stay on China.
This is well, China is the only economy that either is, can, or will challenge the United States power. But what if we think about the US as a hotspot? Ooh, now we're going provocative. The US has been the power for, let's say a couple hundred years. The US does not want to lose that number one position. Does that make the US a hotspot if that number one position is now being challenged?
Yeah, I think the US, yeah, it's tough to separate because we live here. The US, the blessed geography isn't going anywhere. The US will remain a preeminent power so long as that geography is sustained, right? So here we're talking about either the agricultural
It's a retracement, a retracement of our desire for globalization.
Yeah,
that
I
is
get
the
it.
risk.
Yeah, I get it. And I don't think the US has gone through various cycles of retrenchment from the global stage where it's a little bit introverted, but the nature of the United States is because it so loves the fruits of capitalism, and those have come from globalization, inevitably the United States reemerges due to its own greed. I'm just going to say it. I think to me, going back to China, the Straits of Malacca and energy development in China, you have to bear that in mind. One of the checks on Chinese communistic expansion has traditionally been that they don't control their energy. So the US Navy has been able to say at various times, hey, you do that, we're going to swoop in from our military bases around you, like Japan, and we're going to protect Taiwan. We're also going to project power in the Straits of Malacca, and you're just not going to have energy. And just through attrition in 6 months, we know you're not going to be able to continue fighting. Going back to the US, I had a conversation once with somebody who happens to be on this call. It wasn't you, Michael, about the fact that people like to, in the United States, they find the investment in the US military disproportionate relative to, all other countries on the planet. And I said, you have to understand United States power is unitary. And this is one thing that to pay attention to in your evaluation of the United States. And by unitary, I mean, there's military power, there's economic power, and there's idea power. And all three of them have to be understood as a unitary thing. And the United States has tended to wield all three of them simultaneously. And so the military power is very much a part of American power. And that's why the US, has an insane military budget. And so in terms of hotspot, the United States may step back from the global stage, but I think it'll step back on. And even if it becomes the number 2 or even number 3 power, I don't know who the number 2 would be economically, Americans are not going to really notice a huge change in their quality of living is my prediction. So I wouldn't call it a hotspot.
Yeah, so the only other hotspot we can start to talk about, but we're out of time essentially, is India and Pakistan and aspects of that relationship because they both have nuclear capabilities. And India, from a demography and from a geography, that's an interesting region to better understand.
Agreed. Yep, that's the tension in Kashmir. Very interesting region.
Yeah, with China as well, when we start getting into the mountainous false geographic lines on a piece of paper.
Agreed. In India, I think the hotspot for India, the Kashmiri region is interesting from a geopolitical perspective, but internally, the people and preferences are not aligned, right? That is one of the other blessings that the United States has had, is that culturally it's fairly, homogeneous. India doesn't benefit from that yet. And when they start to get alignment and greater homogeneity, I would imagine that India's economic problems will start to correct as well. Looks like we have a comment. Somebody has commented here. Oh, Fatima says, for the record, it's always great to hear and see you both. I think, thank you. You're still with us. Thank you so much for saying that. Are there any questions with the, or a question with the like 2 or 3 minutes we have left? Anybody? I'll take that as a no. So may I thank you all for joining us, and thank you for going through the technical issues that we had at the beginning. Hope it was a great conversation. This, along with all of the other podcasts, are on our YouTube channel from the Research Chair. If you like it, subscribe, then you can get all of them. You'll get notice of the new ones that are published if you can't attend. And we should see you. We haven't a topic undetermined. We should see you in 2 weeks on the 16th of September. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you all. Cheers.